recording. All right. So our ultimate goal for today is to understand the following sort of statement that basically was at the very end of the reading for today, that the history of Western philosophy is the history of nihilism. All right. We want to get to a position today where we can understand what in the world that claim means. And what are some of the weird implications of it. There's going to be some very strange implications of it. In a very real sense, Christianity, at least conceived of in a certain way, produces nihilism. Nietzsche and Heidegger think. And yeah, I'm just going to say Nietzsche, but you can throw in Heidegger if you want. Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche. Anyway, right. Is that like Christianity, in a certain very real sense, causes nihilism, produces nihilism. Platonism causes nihilism, produces nihilism, right? That this is a sort of historical movement, not a particular philosophy. And so when Nietzsche says God is dead, or quotes Hegel as saying God is dead, he's not just articulating a position, he's articulating the movement of Western thought in general, including the thought of Christianity itself. And actually, for what it's worth, interestingly, you sometimes do hear Catholics sometimes jokingly say that, yeah, God is dead. That's actually sometimes just jokingly, but with always a hint of seriousness to it within Catholicism too. That's sort of the crisis of Catholicism, is the death of God. Okay. So what do we mean by God then? That's the second thing we need to figure out. What does that possibly mean, this expression, that God is dead? If we can figure out these two things today, that's what I'm after, is to get us a foundation for all of this, and then we can get the difference between complete versus incomplete nihilism next class period. And that's the big takeaway that we need, is that distinction. All right. So let's just start with God is dead. Let's start there. All right. Now, this is one of the more famous things that anyone in the history of philosophy has ever said. And the reason that I know that that's the case is that there was a movie made called God is Not Dead. So that means you're in the culture, right? That means you're in the culture if that is if that's the case, right? No one ever wrote, I think, therefore I'm not. I'm not familiar with that film, right? I mean, this is one of the most famous things probably that any philosopher has said. Also, when Christian apologetics, so apologetics are where you're sort of defending a religious tradition. So when Christian apologetics are defending Christianity, they almost universally see Nietzsche as their primary foe, which Nietzsche would be pleased with. Nietzsche would have delighted Nietzsche, because in his own day, no one cared about him, but he would have been delighted to have been the primary foe of Christianity and be seen as such. So this is indeed on the level of popular culture, I think, to some extent. Okay. But what does that possibly mean to say that God is dead? Let's start with the obvious. If there ever was a Christian God, is that the sort of thing that could die? No. Right? By definition, I mean, in fact, the word that God, or word God comes from in Greek, it originally meant the things that don't die. So right away, we should be struck by how paradoxical this utterance is. So this is God, that which is definitionally undying, is dead. So that which cannot die has died. So puzzling. And of course, you've all, I shouldn't say maybe all, at least maybe some of you have seen the joke sweaters or joke memes that I've seen in some Christian circles. Nietzsche, God is dead. God, Nietzsche is dead. Right? So again, the very idea of, again, human beings killing God also makes no sense. Humans are the things that die, not God. Right? So again, this seems even more paradoxical that a man, Nietzsche, a guy, a dude, right, could be talking about killing God, and indeed could be being seen in some circles to have killed God, or to see himself as having killed God. Right. So that's puzzling. That's pretty weird. Okay, could this just mean God doesn't exist? Could we just read it that way? Well, I think pretty straight away the answer is no. This has to mean something different than that. Right? Because if you just say God doesn't exist, you just like adopt sort of the atheistic position, there are no gods, right? That's not the same as them dying, right? Like them dying suggests something has changed. Presumably they never existed, the gods, but something has changed such that God is, so to speak, now dead, where maybe in the past God was alive. Right. Even though also, again, by definition, God is supposed to be unchanging. Okay. So if all of this is right, if all this puzzle is correct, my hope is that it has to seem pretty obvious that we're not talking about God in the normal sense. And we're certainly not talking about dying in a normal sense. That what Nietzsche means by this formulation is not either God or death in a normal sense of the term. So Nietzsche actually tells us what he means, and Heidegger quotes him, that what he means by God is dead is that the idea of God no longer has any power for us. So it's really a statement about us, supposedly, if we accept him at his word. But I think this too should cause us to be puzzled. Aren't there lots of people who go to church? Or still believe in God, or the idea of God still structures and orients their life in various ways. I mean, that seems inarguable. It's inarguable today. And there are way more atheists today than there were in Nietzsche's time. Right? Nietzsche's writing in like the 1880s or whatever, right? Where this would be even sound stranger to say today, this idea of God no longer has any power over people. Where you can just look around and you see all kinds of people that the idea seems to have a great deal of power for. So what does this mean? To say that the idea of God is dead, that it has no power for us. What did you all take this phrase to mean? Let's just leave Heidegger for a second. What did you all take this to mean? When I'm guessing, again, if there's a movie, God is not dead, I'm guessing that you've all probably heard this said at some point in your lives. What did you take this to mean? This God is dead statement, this God is dead claim?
I took this to mean that God representing the idea, representing this existent, transcendent being itself, this idea of transcendence is itself dying as we become more familiar with the natural world. The more we quest for truth, the more the truth that the transcendent doesn't exist in the physical world becomes apparent. And that gets confused with, if it doesn't exist in the physical world, it doesn't exist at all. And God as the idea itself is the casualty of that.
Yeah, but so then how did you reconcile that? Oh, that's good. Oh, that's really good. But how did you reconcile that with the fact that it seems like there's lots of people who still believe in God or still believe in all that transcendent stuff? because that's the puzzle. That's I guess the weird puzzle that like I want us to start by dwelling with, right? Like, is Nietzsche just like speaking arrogantly, or just like presupposing his own experience as everyone else's experience? Like, my guess is, no one needs to raise their hand or anything, but my guess is probably at least a quarter of you here do not feel that God is the idea of God is dead in your life, or that the idea of transcendence is dead in your life.
So I reconciled that through the fact that, you know, as Charles Taylor points out, people legitimately used to believe that God was present at all times. He saw everything you did to the point of, in like, as you're interacting in the back of your farm, God knows what's going on, kind of deal.
Present in all of life, yeah. Exactly. Present everywhere, yeah.
Whereas now the reason why modern Christianity, you know, kind of teaches the idea that you have to be conscious of yourself when you're making tough decisions when no one else is around. If God was always around, you wouldn't have to worry about that. But now we have to teach that, because there is this inherent understanding that, you know, a part of this is that there is no physical presence almost.
Good. Yeah, no, I think that's getting us somewhere. Good. That's getting us somewhere. That's in a sense that even those who believe in God experience God as being absent in maybe a way that was not true in the Middle Ages, say. Something like that. Certainly that's Taylor's thesis, and Taylor is actually quite influenced by Heidegger in a lot of ways. So again, why you have to read Heidegger. But yeah, so good. I think that's getting us closer to what we mean here. Good. Magnus, go ahead.
So I know it's mentioned in, I think, either one of the excerpts or just Heidegger's summary of Nietzsche here. But I think it's really showcased in, I think it's The Twilight of the Idols by Nietzsche. He describes the progression of the Hinterwelt, I think is the German word, but it's just the world beyond. So it's the, you know, the essential world of either forms or heaven or noumena for Kant. And just seeing the progression of philosophy go, it becomes more and more inaccessible, right? So it starts from participating in the world of forms to, you know, maybe one day you can go to heaven, to, well, actually the noumenal world is you're never going to interact with it, you know, directly. And it's that death of any type of active ability to participate with that other world.
Good. No, I think that's good too. I think we're getting in the direction. It's a tendency of philosophical thought rather than like describing everyone necessarily. Good. That like, yeah, and the way you put that seems exactly right. That there seems to be a kind of like diminishment to the role of transcendence or something, that it seems to get at, that what it's doing in Plato is not what it's doing in medieval Catholicism, is not what it's doing in Protestantism, is not what it's doing for us. Again, a kind of like absence. There's a kind of way in which we can only figure out what Plato's talking about or what the early Christians are talking about through enormous effort. It's wildly counterintuitive to us. The intuitive way of us thinking of these things makes those older philosophies seem almost incomprehensible, almost ununderstandable to us. Good. And again, so something has died within us. Again, none of this is to say we don't believe in God anymore, right? But that a certain way of conceptualizing it is ever more and more alien to us. And maybe if you sort of continue the trajectory of that alienation, you can get to a point where no one does, as if time goes along. Good. Somebody look in the chat. So Lauren had something in the chat. Yeah, so there's also a sense of how this relates to sort of art. That's definitely right. And the idea of sort of limitation, right? Like there's a sense in which like the idea of God no longer strikes us as authoritative in the same kind of way. And in the chat, you're putting that, Lauren, in terms of art. I think that's absolutely right. I think we can also just do it in ethical terms too. I mean, this is unthinkable to us because it's not that people were less greedy back in the day. Literally in 1200 in Europe, no Christian owned a bank. Because the Bible's pretty straightforward that charging interest on loans, called usury, is bad, right? And so therefore in the Middle Ages, people didn't own banks because of that. Like that was authoritative to them, right? They didn't have to like reconcile their guilty conscience or whatever, or justify it or come up with weird prosperity Christianity like moderns do. Like that was just there, so it was just authoritative. People didn't do it. That's where all the anti-Semitic Jews are greedy and money lend. Like because the only people who run banks are non-Christians, which mainly meant Jews in medieval society. right? So that's another sense of the authoritative. It just isn't authoritative anymore, right? It's not authoritative in art. It's also not authoritative in ethics. It's not authoritative in politics. It's not authoritative in life. It doesn't rule us anymore. Again, even if you still happen to believe in God, right? Even if maybe you want to be ruled by God, it's something that you would have to attain or struggle for rather than a default condition. Good. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right too, Lauren. Yeah, I think yeah, everything you're bringing here, you're getting us in really good directions. All right, so let's start looking at the way Heidegger wants to cash all of this out. So we're going to say God just means the transcendent. Or rather, let's use Heidegger's language, the supersensible, because the supersensible is not exactly the same as the transcendent, but they're going to overlap quite a bit. All right. So we need to start doing metaphysics. All right. And so Heidegger gives a very particularized definition of metaphysics. I don't like it very much. I kind of don't like the way Heidegger does this, but we'll just go with it because it is the way I think Nietzsche's doing it, and it's also probably the way most modern people use the word metaphysics too. So metaphysics, as Heidegger defines it at least, it's an account of being, it's an account of what is, that is rooted in the distinction between the supersensible and the sensible. And so he distinguishes ontology from metaphysics. Ontology is just the investigation of being. The Greek word ontos is the word for being, so the study, the logos of being. And metaphysics is a particular way of doing ontology. That's fine if he wants to define it that way. That doesn't have, I don't see how that has any correlation with Aristotle's doing in the metaphysics, but whatever, he wants to define it this way, so we can run with it. We can run with this as an account. All right. The key for this, why is this worth bringing up, is that the idea of the supersensible only makes sense in relation to the idea of the sensible, and vice versa. You only have a sensible world if you also have a supersensible world. And the idea here is just that the concepts are sort of like mutually entail one another. They're sort of like mutually entailed concepts. They're defined in reference to the other. And so when the madman is running around screaming, "God is dead, God is dead," right? And the atheists are all like, what happened to God? Did you lose God, madman? Like, what happened? Like, and the madman's just like, don't you realize what's happened? We destroyed the sensible world too, right? The sensible world as an idea only makes sense. It's only defined in terms of the supersensible world. So this is the first thing we need to start breaking down a little bit to try to understand in order to get this nihilism thing, to figure out what all this talk of nihilism is pointing toward. So let's begin here. Let's begin actually by going back to the genealogy of moral stuff. Let's just that's why I wanted to start there first. Let's remind ourselves what Nietzsche was saying in the genealogy of morals. So we saw that for the master morality, right, for the aristocratic warrior class, right, they had no need of any kind of notion of transcendence or supersensible or anything of that sort, right? They also didn't have, correspondingly, if Heidegger's right, they didn't have any conception of a sensible world either, right? They just had a world that they did stuff in. And the reason why we said that they had no need for such a distinction was that they were perfectly content and satisfied with the world. right? Their world said, we're great, and the world constantly was reaffirming that they were great, and the world constantly says it sucks to be a slave, and the world was constantly affirming that it sucked to be a slave. Right? So you wouldn't have any grounds to draw a distinction or a kind of dissatisfaction with the world. Whereas slave morality, we said, was almost dependent upon that kind of distinction, because the slave's world appears contradictory. According to their system evaluation, the God-loved are the most wretched, are the sick, are the poor, are the enslaved. Right? And so therefore the happy. But reality is in a very real sense constantly saying it sucks to be a slave and it would be better to be a master. Right? So in a sense, the slave kind of agrees maybe that reality is affirming what the master says is the case. But reality must be wrong then, though. There must be something wrong in the presentation of reality. That gap is what's required a kind of distinction. There's the world as it appears to be, where maybe it looks like the master is the one who's doing well. But then there's the world as it really is, where the slave is the one who's doing well. Right? There's a distinction between how the world seems to be and its reality. And then we talked about how the ascetic priest sort of uses that distinction as a kind of like cure for dealing with the suffering of all life, because life in general just produces a great deal of suffering. And so the cure of the ascetic priest is to, in effect, say, yes, 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 suffering here is really bad, but all that's kind of just illusion. All that's an illusion, just like it's an illusion that the masters are really happy and the slaves are really miserable. So too is all of this suffering that's endemic to life an illusion, illusory. And the real reality is free from suffering, right? Something that transcends our condition of suffering, our normal condition of life, and the fact that life generally kind of sucks. You get 3 feet of snow and then hurt your back trying to solve it. It's just that stuff happens, right? Right? Like the true reality doesn't feature any of that. Be the true reality heaven, be the true reality mystical union with God, be the true reality nirvana, be it Buddha nature, whatever the true reality is, it doesn't have those features of suffering, right? And so it's sort of like it's predicated again upon a kind of like falseness of the reality that's presenting itself to us. That's why these concepts don't make sense independently of one another for both Nietzsche and Heidegger. The problem is that the sensible world has to be announcing its own inadequacy in some sense for it to be described as the sensible world. And for it to be the super sensible world, right, it has to be fixing the inadequacy that was seen in the sensible world. Neither makes sense without the other. We would only ever call it the sensible world because we're saying merely sensible, right? Like there's sort of an implicit pejorative there, right? Like it's the merely sensible world. It's the merely apparent world. It's not the real world, right? And the real world, conversely, has to be the one that fixes the inadequacy of the sensible one. So like the way this frequently gets said, the sensible world is filled with flux and change. The super sensible is the eternal and unchanging. Right? The sensible world doesn't have any implicit meaning, is deprived of meaning in some sense. Right? The super sensible world is what supplies the meaning. Maybe the sensible world is the one that's filled with suffering. Right? The super sensible world is the world that's free of suffering. And again, this is all very broad. Like, there's lots of specific philosophy. We're not talking about any one philosophy here, right? But like, there's lots of different philosophies that could fit within this rough framework. But like, these are the kinds of mutual dependencies that exist between those two notions. And so, if God is dead, if we kill the super sensible, the sensible world no longer makes any sense either, because the sensible world as a sensible world was defined in terms of how it's the inadequate one that needs the adequate one to justify it, to suspend it, right? And so this is why the madman says, you know, we've killed God, therefore everything is now up for grabs. We can't just fall back on the sensible world because the sensible world was the one that wasn't good enough on its own. And so if we're left with nothing being good enough on its own, we're just kind of screwed, right? And that's why the madman is the atheist for Nietzsche in that story is the one who doesn't get all this. The atheist is like, oh yeah, I don't believe in God. That doesn't change any of my other beliefs, right? So the sort of, you know, the sort of, he's basically doing Taylor's exclusive humanist. They're like, yes, I'm the prim, proper British gentleman. I don't believe in God anymore. I'm a good businessman, but I still affirm the order of mutual benefit, and I still act more with the exact same system of ethics and the exact same system of science, and my understanding of reality hasn't changed. I just erased the word God from my list of things that I think exist. Well, you can't just do that. Cross out the word God, the whole rest of the system's going to collapse too. The basic idea here is that the supersensible is both below as a foundation and above as the goal of the sensible world. That's the implicit logic of this distinction. And it's important that it be both directions. So the goal is as transcendent. And the foundation stuff is a concept that we actually haven't really talked about. It's actually going to be this idea of immanent. The supersensible is both transcendent and immanent in this logic. It's the foundation of things, and it's the goal that sensible things strive for. I should write that slightly differently. Right. And this is Plato's view. This is very clearly Plato's view. You go, Plato's where we're going to go next after we finish our Nietzsche talk, so we can just start talking about him a little bit. Plato entirely affirms both of these. That we can call the sort of world as it shows itself through perception is indeed inadequate on its own terms. It falls short in its own terms, right? And so we must posit what Plato calls forms, sort of supersensible reality that provides the foundation for what intelligibility the sensible world does have, and the goal of life as a sense of transcending the sensible world identically, oriented toward the forms. Right. Now, let's bring in Taylor. Taylor well recognized that his account of religion was not consistent with Platonism. To Taylor's credit, I think, that he recognizes that there's a problem, that Platonism doesn't fit. And in general, when Nietzsche and Heidegger are talking, they don't really talk that much about this foundation stuff either. The way Taylor puts it is that the goal, he gets rid of this foundation stuff and just talks about the goal of the sensible world is the supersensible. Right? Happiness, human flourishing is to somehow be attained beyond it. But the sensible world, according to Taylor, and again, not according to Taylor, but according to Taylor as a historian, so according to Taylor in the 1500s, the sensible world is its own foundation through natural science. So something changed. And indeed, that's why we're actually going to turn to Platonism, because we need to actually understand what changed. Something pretty enormously changed here, actually. And actually, it's not at all clear to me that that Taylor's analysis or even that Heidegger's analysis and Nietzsche's analysis is applicable if you keep the foundation stuff. All right. So let's pause for a second. How are we doing so far with this framework? So I began today with a super bizarre claim that if you deny that there's a super sensible, you also deny that there's a sensible. Do you all feel reasonably comfortable with that claim now?
I don't know.
Questions, concerns, this is the time to challenge it. So go ahead.
I am just, I don't know. I'm not seeing how the transcendent is also the foundation of the sensible world, right? Because it seems you can just take like the evidence of like your eyes or empiricism or whatever just at face value and not affirm anything like that you don't see exists or like observe or can naturally test.
That's a great question. Plato. So next week. My answer is wait till next week, unfortunately. Because we're gonna spend a whole day on exactly that. We're going to spend a whole day trying to figure out what actually the one is supposed to be doing in Plotinus. And it's doing both. It's doing both. For him, it's both the one that pulls you up to it and is the grounding up for you. So it's both of those. So I can't fully answer it today, but even just if we get rid of the foundation stuff, if you say that the sensible world is that which has no goal of its own, and it needs a transcendent goal or a super sensible goal, does that part even make sense?
Shoot, sorry, I was muted. Yes, but then like you run into the problem of like people just accepting the fact that there is no goal, and like yeah, I'm depressed, but it's the truth, so whatever.
Right. Yeah, and that's where Nietzsche, in a sense, wants to go. Nietzsche just wants to go more radically with that, with that acceptance of it. He basically, the incomplete nihilism is sort of like not doing that fully. So like saying you're doing it but not doing it actually. That's the problem with the exclusive humanist, is that they're nihilists too, but they're pretending that they're not. Or they're acting as if nihilism is not true. So that's fair, but it's not Nietzsche wouldn't necessarily see that as a problem or a critique. And the question is going to be, how could you affirm that there's no goal? If you still are talking as if there's a goal, though, you're talking as if there's a super sensible. Is that part okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. Excellent. Magnus, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
So in the definition of especially the super sensible world, you use very active language like goal, or it's trying to fix the sensible world or something.
Right.
How does that apply to a very disconnected sort of other world, like with Kant, where there's not like, I mean, if we're just looking at like, if you exclude the practical reason stuff, where is the goal or the telos in the actual metaphysic?
Did you just say if we exclude the practical stuff from Kant? Oh, you've killed him. You've slayed him, because that's the whole thing for Kant. Because that's basically the answer to your question. The way this shows up in Kant is precisely the way in which the world is disclosed, the phenomena, right? The world is disclosed through cognition, right? Precisely lacks dignity, rationality, intelligibility, and anything other than the sort of sense of natural science, but not in the sort of like goal, tell us of life stuff sense.
Okay, because he still has like a sensible and super sensible world, right?
He does.
Phenomenal and noumenal. So like, I mean, I feel fine in calling the noumenal world the super sensible world, but there is no fixing part of it. So how do I reconcile this with this definition?
So in him, so consciousness, again, this is supposed to be more general than any specific philosopher, but we can talk about how it's working in Kant. I think that would be helpful. The way that Nietzsche sees this still as at play in Kant is that Kant recognizes, hey, the world of natural science is meaningless. It's intelligible. It has these intelligible categories, right? The table, the categories, and all that. So it's intelligible. It can be understood. Which again is what's different from the Platonism, because the Platonism position is you can't even be understood on its own terms. But it's intelligible, but it's meaningless, and that's unbearable. Now you say, well, is it unbearable from the standpoint of the phenomenal world itself? And maybe in the critique of judgment, he actually does reach that conclusion. So in the third critique, he actually, it's not, it depends on how you read the third critique, but maybe he reaches that conclusion there too, that there's a that particularly with like biological organisms is in the third critique, where like maybe there's like a problem where the intelligibility of the phenomenon isn't fully adequate to the phenomenon themselves. Maybe art, another arena where he thinks this maybe shows itself up. But certainly then in terms of what more generally than that specific answer, right? There's something deep, like profoundly inhumanly unsatisfying with the phenomenal world. And so it's showing itself, at least to us, and he's an idealist, so that's fine. It's showing itself to us as inadequate. And so therefore its adequacy must be grounded in the noumenal.
Okay, so to use just Kant's words, because I think I get what you're saying. If we have some kind of like apodictic certainty about transcendental content, for example,
right.
And we know that that content can't be found in, for example, general logic.
Say causality. Say the law of causality is contrary to the law of freedom.
Yeah, then we need transcendental, whatever you would fill in, transcendental logic or deductions or propositions.
Right.
So that's that sort of notion of fixing, is that there's some necessity for that to be the case that's only solved in the supersensible.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And also,
cool. That makes sense.
And maybe the other side of it may be where there still is a hint of the foundation stuff in Kant too. There is also the thing in itself in Kant, right? Which is precisely supersensible and supposed to be the ground of sensation.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, cool.
So that there too maybe, so you see it both from the practical side and also from the practical categories, but also some of the sort of the sort of a speculative postulates, like the thing in itself or transcendental subjectivity, that also seem to be super sensible, but sort of like necessitated by the sensible manifold or the way the sensible manifold gets organized.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. If you all don't know Kant, that might have been super confusing, so I apologize for those of you who might not know Kant. But think of that, there was basically like an example of how this move is at play within a specific philosopher, was basically what we were just sort of enacting, sort of playing with. All right. Any other sort of question? I thought there was one other person too that I sort of did miss them real fast. So was there any other sort of like questions or concerns or thoughts that people have at this juncture? All right. God is uniquely suited to solve this sort of problem. So let's start pulling stuff up. Okay. If we lose the foundation stuff, so let's just lose the foundation. We'll come back when we get to Plato. But for now, let's just do this transcendent stuff, the transcendent side of it. All right. If we say life is meaningless, well, okay, or say if we say the sensible world is meaningless, or if we say, you know, my individual particulars are meaningless. What again? This is supposed to be so general. This isn't supposed to be any specific philosophy or philosopher that we're talking about. But you know, take your pick from these things. Whatever. All right. Then the source of meaning has to be transcendent. Right? Outside of life, outside of the sensible, outside of the individual. And that's almost on the level of definition that this will have to be true, because we said by definition life is meaningless. So if I'm looking for meaning in life, I'm not going to find it. If I'm looking for meaning in the sensible, I'm not going to find it. If I'm looking for a meaning in individual particulars, I'm not going to find it, right? The source of meaning must be outside what it gives meaning to. Otherwise, you basically would end up with an infinite regress problem. This is basically the solution to the infinite regress. If life is meaningless, the source of the meaning of life must be outside of life. Right? And must be higher than it. That's why, again, and this is, again, the Taylor thing, right? Like, so like people who say life is meaningless if there is no religion are saying, if I have to find my meaning within life on Taylor's account, I'm going to end up just with a bunch of nonsense. I'm going to go to work to make money to go to work. Or I'm going to eat to stay alive, to eat to stay alive, to eat to stay alive. And none of it's going to mean anything. It's not going to go anywhere because the whole system is meaningless on its own. The meaning has to come from something outside. And if the source of meaning was therefore part of life, it's going to be just as meaningless as everything else in life. So a transcendent source does real work if you're seeing the world in this way that a non-transcendent source won't do. If you want to put it this way, and I see a question in the chat, so I'll turn to that in just 1 second. But if you want to put it this way, if the source of meaning has to be within life, I can always ask why about it. I can't ask why about the transcendent thing. The transcendent thing is supposed to be the answer to all why questions. If I'm talking about something within life, I can always ask a why question of it. So let me try to make this clear, because the way I wrote that's not necessarily super clear. So let me try to make this clear with a concrete example. All right. So one way you could, and this is indeed what Plato does when Plato's actually doing all of this, you could basically define God as that which you can't ask the question why about anymore. And this is indeed, you read all the medieval stuff, they're like, it's a category mistake. Why did God create the world? That question is a category mistake. Or why is God God? That's a category mistake. God's the answer to that question. God answers the question of why God created. God answers the question of why God exists. God answers the question of why God has the features or the properties that God has, right? God is sort of God is the sort of self-answer. The kind of thing that actually God is an answer. Right. And that's indeed, and Plato puts that pretty explicitly, actually. Whereas, let's say I say reason is the source of meaning. I can always ask, and reason will always let me ask, why should I be rational? Or let's say let's say instead that I say the order of mutual benefit, let's say the nation state is what's good. I can always ask, why is the nation state good? And that question will always be meaningful, because the thing is the sensible is that which we ask questions about. And again, that ties in with this whole way we've been defining it, right? The sensible is definitionally the questionable that needs something to answer it, the transcendent. Okay. And yeah, someone in the, so let me go to the chat question. Yeah, I think actually the chat question is very much in line with what we were just saying here, right? That like, so let's say you say science is going to answer the meaning of why, right? But it can't do it. Science can maybe get back to the Big Bang, but the natural question that people ask is, but okay, what does the Big Bang mean? Why that? Why care about that? And indeed, it can't, science, by definition, it's not even the task of science. Science wouldn't see itself as trying to ask that question. Yeah, so I think that that comment from the chat from Kevin is exactly to this point. At least I hope that's where Kevin was going with it too.
That is definitely.
Good. Yeah, that's exactly just sort of one version of this. There's a line on, if you go to page 64 from the reading, it's Heidegger sometimes just writes these absolutely chilling paragraphs. It's one of the things that I actually really enjoy with him, where he just like gets to something in an incredibly disturbing way. On page 74, there's this passage where basically Heidegger describes what he sees as sort of the descent of Western civilization from God in the Middle Ages. And it's like, we go from God as being the source of all meaning, to reason is the source of all meaning, to the nation is the source of all meaning, to creativity is the source of all meaning, where creativity now means art, to, oh shoot, business is the source of all meaning. It's like a real quick paragraph. It's, the way he says it is just incredibly disturbing. He says it really well. There's like, that like, you keep trying to find the source of meaning and stuff that by definition can't do the job that's being given to it. Okay. Whereas Nietzsche insists, and Nietzsche says at various points, he's really insisted upon this, Christianity, in contrast, is entirely internally consistent. It is a self-sufficient system. It all makes sense. It all works. It's false. Right? You can be internally consistent and false, but it entirely works. God could do the work, maybe, or at least for a time. God did the work that was needed for Christianity to make sense. All of these other things that we try to replace God or the transcendent with, these immanent sources of meaning, none of them just do the job right. They all just sort of fail to give us the meaning we're looking for, or to be the goal of life in the way that we need them to be, right? And so the highest values devalue themselves. And Magnus, give me just 1 second, and then I just want to write down that passage. And this is how Nietzsche and Heidegger define nihilism. Nihilism is the highest values devaluing themselves from themselves. This isn't an external critique, in an internal critique kind of way. The highest values all prove their own inadequacy. All right, Magnus, go ahead.
So I've always had this question with Nietzsche in particular.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of, or what Christian, what does he mean by Christianity? Is he referring to
Yeah.
sort of anything that falls under the umbrella, or is it German Lutheranism in the 1800s?
Yeah, right.
Or what is that? How specific do we get?
This is important. This is going to be helpful for where we're going to turn for the end. So this is a really good question for where we're going to turn next. Now we're going to turn to nihilism. What he means usually when he's talking about Christianity is what Heidegger calls Christendom in today's reading. He means the institution of the church as a sort of political historical force shaping the West, shaping the Western world. So he means something like organized Christianity, if you want to use that kind of language. And Nietzsche contrasts that with Christ. Actually, very, very specifically. Nietzsche's got his own bone to pick with Christ too, but it's very different than his bone that he wants to pick with Christianity. So you read The Antichrist, which is the last book Nietzsche wrote before he went insane. And The Antichrist is basically two different threads of attack. It's him attacking the church, which he attacks in one way. And he associates the church with St. Paul, basically, with the one who sort of like started to codify these things, the rules and laws and all of that. And then he contrasts that with Christ, who is the real target, who is the real interesting figure for him to oppose.
The last Christian, he calls him.
Yeah,
right?
the last and only Christian, Christ. Yeah, the last and only real Christian was Christ. The rest of you, the rest of us were just a part of Christendom, part of the Christian state, the state or the time, the history structured by a Christian motivated institution. Yeah, and indeed we can say, and this is why this is such a good question for turning into this. We indeed could precisely say that Christendom gets established because of nihilism, because of a kind of failure to be Christ. People aren't being Christ well enough. Well, we need a state then. We need a political order to make people Christ. Because what's the actual problem? So let's now turn to the nihilism stuff. We have a chat question about Hinduism and how that fits in within. Hinduism doesn't really fit in within this particular story that we're telling here. that Nietzsche is trying to tell here. The story that we're telling here, the story of nihilism, is the story of the West. There'd be a different version of it probably going on in India, certainly, or you could see maybe Buddhism as an expression of the nihilism built into Hinduism, perhaps. I think you could maybe tell that story. But yeah, it's not. The story at least is going to be different in India. It's a different history, different institutions. But okay, let's use the remaining time to do the nihilism thing. 3 feet of snow, end of the first year of the pandemic. I think we're ready to do the nihilism thing. All right. The central history of all philosophy, Nietzsche thinks, is this values devaluing themselves. So let's work out the logic here. I just want to do the logic simply, and then we can nuance it and do details, ask questions and stuff. Here's the basic logic. The supersensible posits an idea, right? Some kind of ideal, right? Be it an ideal of justice, or love, or charity, or whatever, right? Fill in the blank, whatever. Godliness. Let's throw that one in. And so what that is to say that it posits it as an ideal is that ideal is then to be realized within the sensible. That's the sense in which this becomes a kind of orientation or a guide, right? I need to realize this kind of justice that I don't see in the world. I need to try to realize it sensibly. Very clearly in Kant, you can see that in case. You can see that in Plato with the form of justice being different than the various actions that people do that are sometimes just, sometimes are unjust. You can do this with a distinction between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man in St. Augustine, right? In various sorts of ways, we have this kind of like these ideals coming from the supersensible, from these sources of meaning. That ideal should then be realized within the sensible. But what's the problem? By definition, the sensible can never actually instantiate the ideal fully. That's precisely why the sensible needs the supersensible. The sensible precisely wasn't adequate to any of these ideals in and of itself. Right? And so let's just do this with the St. Augustine stuff, the king, right? So like we get from the Gospels this vision of a city of God, right? A city of justice, of love, where the rule's not the rule of law, it's not the rule of force, it's the rule of love, it's the rule of charity, it's the rule of godliness. Right? But try as hard as we might to realize that ideal, it will always fail. Any kind of city we make will always, and Augustine says, it'll always be the city of man. It'll always, rubber hits the road, you'll have to force people to do stuff. There won't really be charity because there'll be like sort of these other motives at play that sort of like make it profitable for you to act charitably or to look charitable. Godliness can become a kind of facade and a front that you put on to attain kind of various sorts of advantages. The city of man will never be equal to the city of God. It will never be able to live up to it. The ideal devalues itself. The ideal, your failure to realize it kills the ideal for you. Because the goal is to realize it. And that has to be, that's not just an accidental feature, that's what it is. That's the whole logic of all of this, right? The goal is to realize it in the sensible, and it can't be realized in the sensible. So in Kant, this becomes the idea of an infinite project, right? In St. Augustine, this becomes the ideal of there'll be a difference between the smaller Christian community, the kingdom of God, within the city of man, within the larger say, Christendom, the Christianized Roman Empire, but they'll be fundamentally distinct. Right? And indeed, this frequently leads to kind of like reluctance, right? I mean, ultimately, so like what I was saying earlier, like the failure of people to live up to the ideal of Christ, well, okay, we can at least force them to live up to an approximation of it. Right? The failure of that ideal to be realized leads us to posit a lower ideal, the kingdom of man. Right? Or let's do this with something completely different. Let's do reason as an example. To be truly reasonable, if I hold up reason as the ideal, I would need an absolute foundation for all of my beliefs. Let's do this as Descartes, maybe a certain foundation. What does reason discover? Reason discovers that this never happens. So reason disproves itself. Reason posits an ideal that reason, in fact, never lives up to. And this is Nietzsche's basic stance about rationality and science in general. Why some of the stuff we were talking about last time about all that science as being just another version of the aesthetic ideal for Nietzsche, because it posits truth as an absolute value, but reason can't prove why truth is the absolute value. And Descartes has to cheat in the Meditations to make this work. He had to come up with that crazy third proof that doesn't work at all, that is wildly does not work, in order to actually secure the necessary foundation to make reason be a real feature of the world. The ideals disprove themselves. This is the sense in which, since the history of Western thought is this super sensible distinction, since Plato, basically, that's been the metaphysical framework. Therefore, the history of Western thought is nihilism. It is the story of ideals constantly devaluing themselves. The ideals positing themselves, and then by their own standards, falling short. Leading to new ideas that then fail and fall short. Leading to new ideas that then fail and fall short. And almost like ever increasingly fall shorter. They sort of like work less and less as you sort of get less and less transcendent. They sort of work less and less too. They do the job less. They're not able to do the job as well as the Christian God was able to do the job. And as long as the Christian job, that ideal seemed to be working, you had a self-consistent Christian system. What Taylor was saying was the case in the Middle Ages. Start chipping away at it, the whole edifice is going to collapse. And you'll get just increasingly these values or these ideals posited that just won't be able, they'll even more not be able to do their job. And this is the trajectory of all philosophical thinking, Nietzsche thinks, up to him. Nietzsche's the end of this, because he's going to overturn all values. He's going to finally kill God once and for all. Right? Kill the framework, kill the system that led to this chain of events. Right? Realize nihilism once and for all, or if you want to put it this way, complete nihilism once and for all. Bring it to an end, bring it to a completion. How are we doing there? That work, that makes sense? Do you want to go over it more? Do you want some more examples? What can I do to make, because that's super bewildering what I just said. So you should find it super bewildering. So like, what can I do to make it less, what can we do to make it less bewildering? Yeah, let's do some more examples of this, right? So the state holds that where is human happiness to be found? Human happiness is found within the state. And then World War I happens. Right? And what the states indeed lead to the worst of all sufferings. Right? To the ideal, the instantiation of the ideal falsifies itself. Or the French Revolution. You do the French Revolution, which Nietzsche would have had, the World War I hadn't happened yet, but French Revolution, right, where the French state tries to create a society of liberty, justice, and equality, and to do it, it creates a bloodbath of mass murder. And so falsifies its own ideals. In the course of trying to realize its ideals, it falsifies them. right? By trying. And so then new ideas come up, and you get art. Becomes the idea after the French Revolution, art becomes the new thing. Are those helpful examples? Do they, right? We should all have a goodwill, but a goodwill is impossible. I always seem to have some latent secret motive, some dark little motive of the soul that keeps me from genuinely acting for the sake of goodness. Right? How does this apply to science? Good. So science articulates for Nietzsche the assumption of truth. So we can go back to the truth stuff. That truth is this ideal. Why should truth be the absolute ideal? Can we scientifically prove that truth is a thing? No, I'm sorry, you can't. Turns out, whoopsie. Yeah, no. Again, and it is almost kind of like a whoopsie, like whoops. Turns out actually truth is not actually necessarily a relevant concept in science. Particularly modern science, which sees itself as a methodological and functional rather than as necessarily truth-oriented. This ain't nothing of quantum mechanics, which Heidegger would bring up here at this point. This as another example of modern science disproving itself. Right? The modern science tells us, yes, it's a law-governed natural world that leads us to discover that quantum mechanics is a thing. Whoops. Because there's nothing law-governed. I mean, it's law-governed, but it's random too, in a fundamental sense. Do it in art. We say that art is beauty. Art is the ideal. Art is where human happiness consists in, and then we find a bunch of artists that kill themselves in depression and despair. Right? Say what were they called? There's a class of poets that I'm thinking. I'm forgetting about the confessional poets. There they go. The great confessional poets who are going to like express beauty through art, and who like 7 out of the 10 greatest of them killed themselves by the time they were 30. Right. Or Wagner going to this is Nietzsche for Nietzsche. Nietzsche started loving Wagner and then started to hate him after he fell in love with Wagner's wife. Funny story. But for that, all right. But for Wagner, so what's this in Wagner? Wagner's going to do life-affirming stuff that ultimately ends up falling back into same old gods and sentimentality, right? That Wagner had hated in his youth. Yeah, Vanis, go ahead.
So I just had a question here. I was thinking about this. So I've noticed as I've read Nietzsche, he has a lot of similarities with Hegel. He has a lot of divergent points as well, but he has a lot of similar stuff.
Yeah.
This feels very similar to dialectical progression.
It is, only it's not going somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, it is, only it's not going. Only Hegel thinks this is all going. All these contradictions are going somewhere to absolute knowing, and Nietzsche does. Let's say Nietzsche does not. Nietzsche thinks it's going in the opposite direction. It's going to absolute nothing. It's going to, in Heidegger's language, non-being or nothingness. And yeah, that's like the existentialist reading of Nietzsche, at least. That's going toward, yeah, that it's not it's constructive. Hegel thinks it's constructive. It's leading to something. Nietzsche thinks it's productive and that it's constantly producing new values, but those values aren't going anywhere either. It's all just, it's kind of a dead end that needs a radical reevaluation of the whole system in order to actually start making any real progress.
Gotcha.
All right. So if this is okay, if we're getting a sense of what's going on here, I think we're in a pretty good place to turn next class period to the distinction between complete versus incomplete nihilism. Where we're going with all of this is the thing producing this whole cycle is this distinction between the supersensible and the sensible. If you want to put it slightly differently, it's seeing the sensible as intrinsically inadequate, or seeing, from the master's perspective, reality as inadequate, as false in some sense. Nietzsche thinks all of that is super unhealthy. That whole starting point was unhealthy. It was a sick starting point, so of course it produces sickly results. What would it be to see life as not incomplete, as if meaningless, that not being a problem, right? As not needing to be fixed. What would it be to see life as not needing a fix, not needing a solution? It's not going to be just a reduction of things to the sensible world, because the sensible world is the inadequate one. So it's going to have to be a radical reconception of reality itself in some sense. And that's what Nietzsche's after by complete nihilism. Complete nihilism is no longer being troubled by incompletion, if you want to put it that way, or by limitation. So that's what we're going to do next time. And then that's why we'll finish up Nietzsche. We're going to try to get some rough idea of what he means by the will to power and how that's related to the idea of complete and incomplete nihilism. It's supposed to be complete nihilism. Will to power is supposed to be complete nihilism. Heidegger doesn't think it is. But ultimately, that's what it's supposed to be, the alternative to this super sensible distinction. So what would it actually mean to truly abolish the transcendent? Nietzsche thinks it would mean the will to power. That would be how you'd have to conceive of reality in that way. I'm not sure that makes any sense, but nevertheless, we're going to try to figure out if we can make that work. Try to puzzle to see the puzzles that produces if we're going to try to do that. And Heidegger will help us with some of those, because Heidegger also doesn't think Nietzsche ultimately succeeds. So we can, that's where we'll sort of end with. All right. Any last questions, thoughts, comments, or anything? All right, awesome. Well, thank you all very much for being flexible today. Going Zoom with it rather than doing our face-to-face thing. Hopefully I'll be able to shovel out enough that by Thursday we can go back to face-to-face stuff. If there's any issue, I'll let you all know, but let's assume that for Thursday we'll be back to face-to-face. Then we'll finish up our Nietzsche. I'll hopefully be very close to having the papers done then too. So thank you all very much. Have a good couple days, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Bye.